Imagine a row of capitals at night: Paris, Berlin, Rome, Madrid. The phones are ringing, energy officials are checking shipping maps, military advisors are reading risk reports, and finance ministries are asking one simple question: what happens to us if the Strait of Hormuz becomes unstable for even a few weeks? That is where this part of the story really begins. Because from Washington, a crisis in the Gulf can be framed as a test of strength, a test of deterrence, a test of whether American power still shapes the region. But from Europe, the same crisis looks very different. From Europe, it looks like exposure. Exposure to oil shocks, exposure to shipping delays, exposure to inflation, exposure to public anger, exposure to economic pain that can reach ordinary families very fast. And once you understand that, the behavior of NATO allies begins to make much more sense. This is a mistake many people make when they talk about alliances. They assume allies think in the same way because they share the same flag, the same meetings, the same public language about values and security. But that is not how serious governments actually work. Serious governments ask a harder question: what does this crisis cost us, and who will carry that cost if it gets worse? That is the real dividing line here. For the United States, the Gulf is part of a wider strategic map. For many European governments, it is also a direct economic pressure point. If Hormuz is threatened, Europe does not experience that as an abstract geopolitical event. It experiences it as fuel prices, industrial pressure, shipping insecurity, insurance stress, and political instability at home. That changes everything. Let us take the major countries one by one. France has always wanted room to maneuver. Even inside NATO, France has often acted like a country that respects alliance structures but does not want to be trapped inside them. It thinks in terms of strategic autonomy. It wants influence without total dependence. So if Paris sees a crisis growing in the Gulf, it will not automatically assume Washington's approach is the only workable one. It will ask whether France needs its own channel, its own leverage, and its own way of protecting its interests. Germany is different, but the conclusion can point in the same direction. Germany is not driven first by military ambition. It is driven by stability. Its economy depends on industry, exports, energy, and predictability. A prolonged Hormuz crisis threatens all of that. So Berlin looks at escalation and sees a chain reaction. Higher energy costs, pressure on factories, slower growth, more domestic anger, more political weakness. In that environment, Germany has every reason to fear a military path that it cannot control. Italy sees the Mediterranean in a very direct way. It understands the region not only as strategy but as proximity. Trade routes, shipping networks, North Africa, energy flows, migration pressure, and regional instability all touch Italian interests quickly. Rome does not need a theory seminar to understand what Gulf instability can mean. It can feel the consequences much faster than Washington can. Spain, too, has reason to think first in terms of practical consequences. Energy, trade, domestic balance, and foreign policy flexibility all matter. And when a government believes a crisis may directly hit its economy, it will often choose pragmatism over symbolism. So here is the key point. What some people call betrayal may look very different from inside European decision-making rooms. From there, it may look like caution. It may look like national survival. It may look like a refusal to let alliance politics drag them into a deeper crisis without a clear benefit. And that is where the story becomes more serious, not less. Because alliances do not become weaker only when members openly rebel. They become weaker when members begin ranking their own survival above the alliance's political discipline. They become weaker when national calculations start to override collective signaling. They become weaker when the question changes from how do we stand together to how do we protect ourselves if this goes wrong. That is a change we may be watching here. And it is important to be precise. This does not mean NATO is finished. It does not mean Europe is leaving the American security system tomorrow. Institutions this large do not disappear in 1 week. But function can change long before form changes. That is a real warning. The alliance may still look solid from the outside. Summits, statements, handshakes, declarations. But if major members are already thinking in separate timelines, separate risks, and separate channels, then the alliance is becoming less automatic, less instinctive, less obedient. That matters because the old power of NATO was never just military hardware. It was predictability. It was the belief that in a crisis, America could assume a certain level of alignment from its allies. If that assumption becomes weaker, then every future crisis becomes harder to manage. And that brings us back to Trump. In this story, Trump represents the demand for visible loyalty, a public show that the alliance still follows Washington when the pressure rises, but Europe may be looking at the same pressure and reaching a different conclusion. Not that America is irrelevant, not that NATO no longer matters, but that blind alignment may now be more dangerous than controlled distance. That is a profound shift. Because once allies start choosing distance over loyalty in moments of real danger, the alliance has entered a new phase. Not open collapse, something more subtle, and in some ways more important. A phase where the words remain the same, but the calculations underneath them begin to change. And when the calculations change, history usually follows. Some battlefields do not look like battlefields. They look like narrow blue water on a map, a shipping lane, a legal route, a place most people never think about until the whole world starts talking about it at once. That is the Strait of Hormuz, and this is where the story becomes more serious than many viewers first assume. Because once a crisis reaches a choke point like Hormuz, we are no longer dealing only with speeches, alliances, or diplomatic theater. We are dealing with the machinery of the world economy. We are dealing with oil tankers, insurance risk, naval escorts, fuel markets, commodity pricing, industrial planning, and the confidence of governments that depend on stable flows of energy every single day. This is why choke points matter so much in geopolitics. They force honesty. A leader can make a speech, a ministry can issue a statement, an alliance can release a declaration full of strong language, but a choke point does not care about language. It cares about control, exposure, and fear. It asks a very simple question. Who can affect movement here, and who must adapt because of it? That is why the Strait of Hormuz is not just part of the story. It is the test inside the story. If you want to understand whether American power still sets the terms, whether NATO still moves as one, and whether regional actors now hold more leverage than before, you do not begin with the press conference. You begin with the waterway through which so much of the world's energy must pass. Now let us go deeper. The importance of Hormuz is not theoretical. A major share of global oil exports passes through this narrow corridor. For energy importers, even the threat of disruption can be enough to trigger anxiety. Tanker operators become more careful. Insurance premiums rise. Markets begin pricing in risk before any full shutdown even happens. Governments start contingency planning. Strategic reserves become part of the conversation. Importing countries ask how long they can absorb the shock. Ordinary people may not follow every naval move in the Gulf, but they feel the result later through fuel prices, transport costs, inflation, and political stress. That is the real power of a choke point. It turns geography into leverage. And once geography becomes leverage, everyone involved must reveal what they truly believe. That is why the behavior of European allies matters so much here. If governments in Europe begin acting as though Hormuz requires its own direct diplomacy, its own direct management, and its own separate risk calculations, then they are telling you something very important without needing to say it aloud. They are telling you that the crisis is too real to be left inside old alliance assumptions. They are telling you that access matters more than appearances. They are telling you that regional reality may now be stronger than alliance ritual. This is where many analysts make a mistake. They still talk as though the central issue is whether Europe remains emotionally loyal to Washington. But geopolitics is not an emotional system. It is a system of pressure, exposure, and adaptation. If the Strait of Hormuz becomes the center of risk, then governments will move toward whoever can affect stability there, whoever can disrupt it, and whoever must be engaged to reduce uncertainty. That is the key point. A choke point strips away illusion. It shows who has reach, it shows who must negotiate, it shows who cannot simply impose outcomes from a distance. And once that happens, the structure of power becomes easier to see. Now widen the frame. If European governments are adjusting their behavior around Hormuz, what does that tell countries outside Europe? What does it tell Gulf monarchies that rely on secure exports? What does it tell Asian powers whose industries depend on Gulf energy? What does it tell China, India, Japan, South Korea, and every state that watches the Gulf, not as a news story, but as a supply line question? It tells them that the old assumption of automatic American management is no longer enough on its own. That does not mean America is gone. It does not mean the US Navy has stopped mattering. It does not mean Washington has no influence. But it may mean something more subtle and more important. Other states are beginning to act as though the situation can no longer be understood through American control alone. That is how international systems begin to shift. Not always through formal declarations, not always through dramatic treaties, but through quiet adaptation, through governments updating their calculations, through officials treating a new reality as something durable enough to plan around. And once governments begin planning around a new reality, they help make that reality stronger. That is why the battle over Hormuz is not only about oil. It is not only about tanker routes. It is not only about naval deterrence. It is about who writes the practical rules of the next phase. Because the government that can shape behavior around a strategic choke point shapes far more than one region. It shapes pricing, diplomacy, leverage, and expectations. It shapes how allies behave. It shapes what neutral countries prepare for. It shapes whether the global order still moves through one center or starts fragmenting into several. So here is the uncomfortable conclusion of part 3. The real battlefield is not just where missiles fly, it is where the world decides how to move, whom to call, and whose permission matters. And in the Strait of Hormuz, those decisions may already be revealing that the old map of power is no longer enough to explain the new one. Because when the world's most important shipping corridor becomes a place where allies start improvising, markets start trembling, and governments start adapting in real time, that is not a side story. That is the main story. And once a choke point becomes a place where truth is revealed, the next question becomes unavoidable. If this is how states behave when the pressure rises, then who is really setting the terms now? Sometimes the most important break in history does not begin with a war declaration, it begins with a change in behavior. Not what governments say, what they do. And that is where the story reaches its real conclusion. Because if NATO allies move toward the Strait of Hormuz in ways that did not fully follow Washington's political line, then the biggest issue is not a personal slight against Trump. The biggest issue is that the Western alliance may be entering a new phase, a phase where formal unity remains, but practical obedience becomes weaker. That is a much larger story. For decades, the strength of the American alliance system came from something deeper than military hardware. It came from deference. It came from the assumption that when Washington defined a crisis, most allies would treat that definition as the central one. They could disagree at the margins. They could complain privately. They could ask for adjustments. But in the end, the structure held because America still set the framework. This is why the Hormuz moment matters. Because what we may be seeing here is not the end of NATO, but the end of something more subtle and more important, automatic alignment. And once automatic alignment begins to fade, every alliance meeting, every future crisis, and every demand for solidarity becomes more difficult. Now let us talk about Trump. In this story, Trump represents pressure. He represents the demand that allies show loyalty clearly, publicly, and without hesitation. He represents the idea that the alliance still functions through visible political discipline. So when allies appear to move in ways that put economic survival, regional flexibility, or national interests above that discipline, the problem becomes larger than one administration. It starts to reveal a deeper limit, the limit of American leverage over friendly capitals. That matters because power is not just the ability to issue threats. Real power is the ability to shape the decisions of others even when the costs are high. If allies begin acting as though American anger is a manageable risk, but Hormuz instability is not, then they are telling you something blunt. They are telling you which pressure they fear more. And that is the real verdict of this episode, not delivered by speeches, delivered by choices. This is also why the title uses the language of betrayal. Not because every ally has turned into an enemy. That would be too simple and it would not be accurate. These are still American partners. They still depend on the broader Western system. They still share intelligence, trade, defense cooperation, and institutional ties. But they may now be treating American preference as one factor among many, instead of the final command. That is a historic change if it continues, because alliances can survive disagreement. What they struggle to survive is a slow shift in internal belief. A shift from Washington leads, we follow, to Washington has a view, but we will decide for ourselves. Once that becomes normal, the alliance still exists, but it no longer works in the old automatic way. It becomes slower, more fragmented, more conditional. Every crisis turns into a negotiation. Every show of unity becomes harder to build. Every regional escalation opens space for outside powers to test the system. And that brings us to the wider world. If American allies are becoming more selective, then rivals are watching closely. Russia watches for fractures. China watches for hesitation. Regional powers watch for signs that the old order is becoming less disciplined. Gulf states watch for signals about who can still guarantee stability. Smaller countries watch and learn a simple lesson. In a less united system, there is more room to maneuver. That is how global orders begin to change. Not always through one great collapse, sometimes through accumulated adjustments. One ally choosing distance, another opening a separate channel, another protecting trade first, another refusing to carry someone else's strategic burden. Then over time, the center still speaks as if it controls the whole system. But the system underneath it becomes looser, harder to command, and more expensive to hold together. Now bring this down to the level that matters to ordinary people. When alliance cohesion weakens, the costs do not remain inside elite meetings. They move outward. A more fragmented order means more uncertainty in energy markets. More uncertainty means higher prices, more volatility, more insurance risk, more supply chain stress, and more pressure on households that are already carrying too much. The effects of a strategic choke point do not stay in military briefings. They show up at fuel stations, in electricity bills, in transport costs, and in the price of daily life. That is why this story matters beyond politics. It is not only about Trump. It is not only about NATO. It is not only about the Gulf. It is about whether the old system that kept some order in place can still force alignment when pressure rises, or whether we are moving into a world where more actors improvise, more capitals hedge, and more crises spread their costs across ordinary societies. So here is the final point. The most important verdict on this conflict may not come from the states that exchange threats. It may come from the allies who quietly adjusted. Because governments reveal their deepest beliefs through behavior. And behavior, in this case, suggests something serious. NATO may still speak the language of unity, but the Hormuz episode hints that the real map of power is already changing underneath that language. So be skeptical. Watch the sequence, follow the incentives, ignore the performance, and study the movement. Because when allies start moving for themselves around the world's most important energy choke point, the question is no longer whether the old order is under pressure. The question is how much of it has already changed before most people were willing to say it out loud.